Have you ever wondered why the more you reach for closeness, the further he seems to drift? What you think makes him feel pressured may, paradoxically, be the very thing that awakens his longing to return. Most women believe intimacy is sparked through constant availability, but the truth is far more elusive. It is often the space, the mystery, the subtle invocation of archetypal energies that calls a man forward. Carl Jung believed that our relationships are battlegrounds of unconscious projections, and the dance between male and female is never about logic alone, it is the unconscious searching for wholeness. And so, the moves that make him chase intimacy are not loud, desperate signals but quiet shifts in energy, rooted in the archetypal depths of the feminine. The first movement is the embodiment of the mystic, the archetype that dwells in silence, in the shadows, in the spaces between words. She is not defined by what she gives, but by what she withholds, not in cruelty, but in reverence for her own inner world. A man, in the presence of the mystic, feels a tension he cannot solve with reason. He senses an ocean within her, and yet no matter how much he sails, the horizon always extends. This paradox awakens pursuit, because his unconscious reads it as a mirror of his own incompleteness. You may notice that when you stop explaining, stop overgiving, and instead rest into your stillness, his gaze begins to sharpen, his desire to know you intensifies. The chase begins not when you run, but when you stand unmoved, veiled in your own depth. The second movement is the expression of the nurturer, but not in the flattened form society glorifies. This is not servitude, nor is it the martyrdom of pouring endlessly until empty. True nurturing, through the Jungian lens, is selective, boundaried, and infused with power. It is the act of offering warmth as a choice, not an obligation. A man feels the difference immediately, the unconditional yet self-respecting energy that radiates from a woman who knows her own worth. Imagine this, when you touch his arm, not because you must, but because your soul feels drawn in that moment, the act transforms from routine into revelation. It is not the quantity of nurture that ignites intimacy, but the sovereignty behind it. The paradox here is that the less you try to meet every need, the more he feels compelled to move toward you, to earn the moments of softness you allow. The third movement is the fierce yet delicate presence of the sovereign. She is neither queen of domination nor servant of approval. She stands in her own authority, rooted in her values, unshaken by his withdrawal or his storms. This archetype is magnetic because it does not beg, it invites. In her presence, a man feels the confrontation of his own shadow, the part of him that craves both freedom and tethering, both chaos and order. Her boundaries do not push him away, rather, they force him to recognize his own hunger for structure, for someone whose self-respect demands his best. When you say no without guilt, when you say yes without fear, you embody the sovereign, and his unconscious begins to chase, not merely you, but the version of himself that only awakens in your presence. Each of these archetypal moves, the mystic silence, the nurturer's sovereign warmth, the sovereign's rootedness, does not manipulate, but reveals. They mirror the paradoxes of intimacy, closeness born from distance, desire born from restraint, commitment born from freedom. And as he chases, what he truly pursues is not possession of you, but the lost fragments of his own psyche reflected in your archetypal mirror. When a man begins to move toward intimacy, it is rarely the surface gestures that pull him forward, but the undercurrent of archetypal resonance he feels in the presence of the feminine. Beneath his rational mind, beneath his rehearsed confidence, something ancient stirs, the longing for the anima, the hidden feminine within his unconscious. Jung taught that the anima is not simply a fantasy of beauty or affection, but a profound image that shapes how a man relates to women and, by extension, to his own soul. When you embody archetypes with clarity and depth, you awaken this anima in him, and suddenly his chase is not for your body alone, but for the mystery of his own completion reflected in your eyes. The mystic, when lived fully, is not coldness or avoidance. She is not withholding to punish. Rather, she moves like a shadowed forest, dense, alive, untamed. A man enters such a space and feels his own instincts sharpen, as though he must hunt differently, listen more deeply, walk with reverence. He cannot consume her because she is not consumable. You, when you slip into the mystic's energy, remind him that intimacy is not endless access, it is sacred access. This unsettles him, yes, but also compels him to reach further, to lean in, to offer something of himself in exchange for the privilege of being let into your inner sanctum. The paradox is profound: the less you reveal immediately, the more he feels there is to know, and intimacy transforms into an initiation, not a transaction. The nurturer, when rooted in self-worth, becomes an oasis rather than a flood. Many women, out of fear of loss, attempt to drown a man with affection, hoping the saturation will secure his loyalty. But what the masculine seeks is not a mother who overextends, but a woman whose warmth is rare enough to be valued, and strong enough to withstand rejection. The modern man, though often unaware, is deeply hungry for this balance, a tenderness that affirms without enslaving, a care that flows without drowning. When you, as nurturer, place limits on your giving, his unconscious interprets this not as rejection, but as truth. It is the boundary that makes the water pure. It is the refusal to overgive that signals your value. And in that recognition, his desire to be near you intensifies, not out of entitlement, but out of reverence. He begins to chase because he senses he cannot take you for granted. The sovereign, in contrast, confronts him with the reality of his own instability. She does not collapse at his silence, nor does she rage at his withdrawal. She remains rooted, centered, aligned with her own axis. This steadiness unsettles the masculine ego because it exposes his projection. He cannot define her as clingy, nor dismiss her as indifferent. She is both receptive and immovable, a paradox he cannot resolve without transformation. And so he chases not to conquer, but to stabilize himself in the orbit of her power. He begins to realize that intimacy with her is not a conquest but a covenant. Her presence demands his best self, and the deeper truth is that every man longs, though often unconsciously, to rise in the presence of a woman who embodies the sovereign. These archetypal moves are not about technique but about becoming. They are not roles you perform to lure him, but dimensions of feminine power you inhabit because they are your birthright. The man chases intimacy not because you trick him, but because, in your wholeness, you ignite his own. He feels in you the invitation to step out of the trivial. Intimacy, in its rawest form, is not the exchange of bodies but the collision of archetypes. When a woman begins to live her mystic, her nurturer, her sovereign without apology, she ceases to orbit around a man's validation. Instead, she becomes the center, and his unconscious begins to reorient itself around her. This is the essence of the chase, not a childish game of pursuit and retreat, but the deep magnetic pull of the masculine psyche toward the feminine energy that mirrors both his longing and his lack. Jung described this as the path of individuation. The man seeks union not only with her, but with the lost parts of himself that her archetypes awaken. The mystic stirs his hunger for mystery. Her silence becomes a mirror to his own noise, her depth a reflection of his shallowness. When she listens without rushing to fill the space, when she looks without explaining away her gaze, she pulls him into the void where his own fears and desires surface. He chases intimacy with her because her presence unsettles his complacency. He cannot rest in superficiality when confronted with her essence. What you might have feared would push him away, your refusal to overexpose, your insistence on inner solitude, is precisely what draws him closer, because it forces him into contact with his own unconscious. In her, he does not find answers, he finds the right questions. The nurturer reminds him of his need for refuge, yet she does so without sacrificing herself. A man does not fall into intimacy when every need is met without effort, he falls when he senses the sacred weight of her care, given not out of compulsion, but choice. This awakens something primal, the awareness that he must cherish her or lose her. Her selective tenderness creates the paradox of intimacy. He chases not because she overwhelms him with affection, but because he never knows when her warmth will open like sunlight breaking through a canopy. You, when you embody this, become unforgettable. He may taste many waters, but none quench him like yours, because yours is given from a well that is not dry, but fiercely protected. The sovereign calls him into responsibility. Intimacy here becomes a test. Will he step into his own authority, or shrink back into boyhood? The sovereign's strength is not loud, it is the quiet refusal to abandon her center. When she says yes, it means something, because she has also said no. When she forgives, it is not weakness but strength, because she could have walked away. In her presence, he feels the confrontation of his own shadow, the laziness, the avoidance, the fragile ego. And yet, rather than repel him, it drives him forward. He chases because he knows that to be near her requires becoming more than he currently is. Intimacy with her is not casual, it is consecrated. And the unconscious man, though he may resist consciously, cannot escape the gravitational pull of that demand. Through these archetypes, intimacy ceases to be a prize or a negotiation. It becomes alchemy. You embodying these moves does not merely change how he sees you, it changes how he sees himself. His pursuit becomes less about possession and more about transformation, though he may not have words for it. And for you, the secret is this: intimacy is not what you secure by running after him, but what you create by standing so. The deeper truth is that intimacy is never handed to a man, it is awakened within him, like a seed pushed into the soil by pressure, darkness, and mystery. When the feminine archetypes rise within you, they act not as tactics but as forces. The mystic confronts him with his longing for transcendence, the nurturer softens him with selective grace, and the sovereign demands his integrity. He begins to chase not out of compulsion but because something in him knows that without this pursuit, he will remain unfinished. Jung once wrote that every man carries within him the image of woman, the anima, and it is through relationship with the outer woman that he encounters his own soul. When you embody archetypal depth, you cease to be merely his partner, you become his mirror. The mystic unsettles the rational man because she cannot be solved. He tries to predict her, tries to explain her silence, yet her essence escapes his logic. And it is in this escape that he feels compelled to chase. For the first time, he realizes that intimacy is not possession, it is revelation. He seeks her not to own her, but to glimpse the veiled truths that seem to shimmer just beyond his reach. What you may consider withholding, he experiences as an invitation to step into deeper waters. Her very unknowability becomes the path to intimacy, and he follows it because his soul craves the unknown far more than his ego admits. The nurturer, in her archetypal fullness, does not heal by erasing his pain or dissolving his flaws. She heals by choosing where to pour her waters. She gives warmth without losing her fire, softness without erasing her strength. He feels this difference immediately. With her, care does not infantilize, it dignifies. He chases intimacy with her because he knows her nurture is a privilege, not a guarantee. Her love does not come from fear of abandonment, it comes from the abundance of a woman who knows she can stand alone. And paradoxically, it is this independence that makes her care irresistible. He longs for the shelter of her embrace because it is never given cheaply. The sovereign stands as the final test. She is the archetype that will not collapse into neediness nor puff herself up in arrogance. She remains, whole in herself, commanding respect simply by existing in alignment. When he enters her presence, his unconscious recognizes the demand: to be near her, he must rise. He cannot drag his wounds into her court and expect her to mother them endlessly. He must meet her in the place of responsibility, where intimacy is forged not in dependency but in equality. This terrifies him, yet it calls him forward. He chases her not only because she captivates him, but because she awakens the man he secretly longs to become. Together, these archetypes form a triad of intimacy that no man can resist for long. Not because you play a role, but because you embody what his unconscious has been chasing since childhood: mystery, nurture, and sovereignty. When lived authentically, these energies dismantle the games of modern love and return intimacy to its rightful place, a sacred pursuit. He does not chase to conquer. He chases because his very soul feels that without this union, he will remain fragmented. And so, intimacy becomes not the reward for his attention, but the natural gravity of your archetypal power. Intimacy reaches its truest depth when the woman no longer calculates how to make him chase, but instead becomes the living embodiment of her own archetypal power. At that moment, the dynamic shifts entirely. The chase is no longer about tactics, it is about resonance. He does not run after her because she withholds affection strategically, he runs because the unconscious within him senses something rare, something irreplaceable. Jung taught that true love is never a possession but a confrontation with the self. In you, as mystic, nurturer, sovereign, he glimpses that self, and so he moves, not toward ownership, but toward initiation. The mystic teaches you to be comfortable with your own shadows. Her silence is not absence, but presence amplified. When you stop over-explaining, stop rushing to fill the void itself becomes magnetic. In that void, he feels his own echoes, his own unanswered questions. He comes closer not because you begged, but because the mystery within you ignited the mystery within him. The lesson is profound: the less you collapse into fear, the more he feels compelled to draw near. Intimacy born this way is not fragile, it is elemental. The nurturer in her fullness teaches you that care must flow from abundance, never from depletion. When you give because you fear being left, your warmth turns cold in his psyche, it smells of desperation. But when you give because you overflow, because you choose, because your waters are pure and protected, he drinks differently. He tastes not need, but gift. And every gift carries weight. He chases intimacy with you because he senses the rare treasure of a woman who can stand alone, yet still chooses to give. This paradox, the independence within tenderness, becomes the very heart of his longing. The sovereign teaches you that boundaries are not walls but invitations. To stand in your sovereign is to say, I am whole, and I will not abandon myself for your comfort. In that declaration, his unconscious finds its test. Many men will falter. Some will flee. But the one who stays, the one who chases, is the one who recognizes that true intimacy requires his rise as well. In the presence of the sovereign, a man realizes he cannot stay small. And so he runs after her not to diminish her, but to meet her. Intimacy with such a woman is not simply romance, it is initiation into a higher form of love, where both stand rooted, both stand free. And this is the final paradox: the more you release the need to be pursued, the more pursuit becomes inevitable. When you are no longer attached to the chase, you embody the very energy that calls it forth. You are no longer the woman who anxiously waits for validation, you are the woman who knows that intimacy is not something to beg for, but something to embody. It is then that the dynamic flips. He is no longer the prize, you are. His soul knows it, even if his ego resists. And when he finally draws near, he does not simply chase you. He chases the parts of himself that only awaken in your presence. Here lies your freedom. You were never meant to exhaust yourself trying to earn closeness. You were meant to live your archetypes fully, to let intimacy flow as a natural response to your wholeness. When you release fear, when you stand in depth, when you embody care without depletion, sovereignty without arrogance, and mystery without manipulation, you become the center. He may chase, or he may not, but you remain whole. The power is no longer in his pursuit but in your presence.